Welcome learners, as we have seen in the previous session about the recruitment and mode of employment of the factory workers, we shall now continue with the social profile and the lifestyle of the workers. The Industrial Revolution was a time of great progress. Large factories emerged that could mass produce goods at a low price. People flocked from their farms in the country to the cities to work in the factories, mills and mines. Despite such progress, life was both easy and not easy as a worker during the Industrial Revolution. Now, we shall have a look into the John Bremen research on the industrial labor in post-colonial India. The objective of this session is to analyze the study, the social profile and the lifestyle of the workers. Under the social profile, we shall discuss on the literacy and employment, caste and employment, gender and employment. Then we shall broadly study about the lifestyle of the labor. Before starting to explain the social profile, we shall look into new government regulations, interesting facts about the working conditions during the Industrial Revolution. Unlike today, workers during the Industrial Revolution were expected to work long hours or they would lose their jobs. Many workers had to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. They didn't get time off or vacations. If they got sick or were injured on the job and missed work, they were often fired. A lot of the jobs during the Industrial Revolution were dangerous. There weren't any government regulations to help protect the workers. Workers sometimes had to work closely with powerful machines that had no safety features. It was not uncommon to lose a finger or a limb. Workers in the mines were subject to tiny tunnels that could easily collapse and trap them underground. A lot of facilities where people worked were unsafe. Typically, the lighting was bad, making it difficult to see. Many factories and mines were filled with dust that not only made it difficult to breathe but could cause diseases including cancer. Other places were unsafe fire hazards where they dealt with flammable chemicals or fireworks. The smallest spark could set off a blaze or explosion. The living conditions in crowded cities weren't any better than the working conditions. As more and more people moved into the cities, large slums formed. These places were dirty and unsanitary. Entire families sometimes lived in the small room apartment. With people living so close, diseases spread rapidly and there was very little care to help them get well. New government regulations. In the late stages of the Industrial Revolution, workers began to organize into unions in order to fight for better and safer working conditions. The government also became involved. New regulations were imposed to shorten the work week and to make factories safer. Today, the government keeps a close eye on the business to make sure that workers are safe. Interesting facts about the working conditions during the Industrial Revolution. In 1960, the 5-story Pemberton Mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts collapsed, killing an estimated 145 workers. The poorly constructed building had been packed to the upper floor with heavy machinery. Factories were often very hot during the summer and freezing during the winter. One of the first labor law passed was the Factory Act of 1819, passed in Britain. It made it illegal to employ children under 9 years old. It was seldom enforced, however. As workers organized, they began to go on strike, not work, in order to demand better working conditions and hours. Some early laws actually made it illegal for workers to unionize. Social profile and the lifestyle. Rather than a rural migrant, the majority of studies show that today many, if not most workers have lived in the city or its immediate environs for many years, if not since birth. Those who have only recently settled in urban locations would generally be only too grateful for factory employment, but the lack of experience and contacts needed to compete for it. E. A. Ramaswamy's report from the mid-1970s is by no means exceptional. The textile industry in Coimbatore is near saturation from the employment point of view. Even with the creation of additional capacity, jobs are too few in relation to the number of aspirants, particularly considering the low skill requirement. Literacy and employment. Literacy rates among the workers in large-scale enterprises are quite high. Although it is not really essential for unskilled work, practice shows that the ability to read and write is the minimum qualification for even a temporary hand. Over time, educational qualifications for recruitment to permanent jobs have been continually upgraded. Candidates without a secondary school certificate are no longer considered. The old wisdom held that the first to report for work in the modern urban industries were landless and land poor farmers from the countryside, the social complement to their economic vulnerability being the lower caste. But as industrial employment gained in respectability, the higher caste also began to show interest. Caste and employment. Morris was amongst the first to reject this view, which he traced back to Weber's claim that a significant part of emerging industrial proletariat stemmed from declassed and pariah caste of rural origin. In Mumbai's cotton mill, Morris found that caste was not a relevant, let alone a primary criterion of recruitment, and that untouchables were not discriminated against. But it is interesting that this distinctive institution of caste has been almost entirely ignored in connection with Indian industrialization. No detailed study of the relation of caste to industrial work is available. In the vast array of official investigations into a condition of industrial labor, virtually the sole reference to caste relates to the caste dietary restrictions which employers claimed prevented them from establishing factory canteens. The institution has been treated mainly by anthropologists and almost entirely in its rural setting. Those who have studied caste have ignored industry, and those who have studied industry have ignored caste. Little of this disregard is noticeable in later research, and we now have a considerable body of data on relationship between caste and factory employment. The general conclusion seems to be that the caste composition of the workforce broadly reflects that of an urban population as a whole, though the middle and higher caste are overrepresented in the higher echelon of the industrial work hierarchy, while the bottom ranks have high concentrations of lower caste workers, a correlation which is strongly affected by differences in educational levels. But has the growing discrepancy between the limited supply of industrial work and the enormously increased demand for it led to the exclusion of the socially deprived categories? Harris, amongst the others, offered evidence which pointed in that direction. Moreover, in capital intensive technologically advanced industries, particularly corporate and multinational concerns, staff are almost entirely recruited on the basis of requirements that show a strong bias towards the higher social class. On the other hand, positive discrimination in public sector employment has prioritized the recruitment of the candidates from the scheduled caste and tribes. But, however, one accesses these contradictory current, no demonstration that caste still operates inside the factory gates should be taken to mean that it must still retain its old ideological salience. According to Holmstrom, caste is no longer plausible as a thoroughgoing religious ideology justifying all social and economic relations as parts of a divinely established hierarchy. The main ideology, but not just the language of politics and unions, but much ordinary talk tends to stress moral and social equality. The status inequalities that count depend on jobs, income, lifestyle, manners, and education. Where these things go with caste rank, this is usually because some caste had more access to education and good jobs in the past, a situation that will not last because effective caste job finding networks are not stable or confined to high caste. Gender and employment. More generally, Sharma's conclusion of 25 years ago seems to stand that factories prefer educated workers over the non-educated, urban born over the rural born, and those with industrial experience over the ones having no experience or with a background in non-industrial occupations. But what is still missing from this profile is its gender dimension. Early studies give the impression that women were rarely found in factories. Their apparent absence prompted Kalpana Ram to comment that the virtual exclusion of women from the Indian industrial working class has drawn a little theoretical comment, particularly in the light of their far higher participation in the earlier industrialization of the West as well as in various contemporary third world societies. Her formulation needs some qualification. However, in Mumbai's cotton mills at the end of the 19th and in the early 20th century, for example, women made up 1/5 to 1/4 of the workforce. Although that was far less than in the earlier Western textile industry, it was certainly not negligible. So, how to explain the fact that the steady expansion of the industrial sector brought a fall rather than a rise in the percentage of female factory workers? The primary cause reported is that factory legislation restricted the use of far cheaper labor of women and children in the first few decades of the 20th century. More important in Morris' view is that women's reproductive role causes them to absent themselves more frequently. It is not clear, however, how this argument squares with the huge local variations in the employment of women in textile industries throughout of the country. For Morris, the marginalization of women substantiates his thesis that there was lack of male workers who were ultimately preferred by the industry. by the mid-20th century, industrial work was more than ever a male preserve. The prototypical factory worker was a young man of no more than 30 to 35. Official reports confirm the decreasing participation of women. This decline has been more marked in the textile and basic metal industries. In both cotton and jute textiles, it is attributed mainly to technological changes rendering their jobs redundant. Fixation of minimum work load and standardization of the wages in the cotton textile industry necessitated retrenched of women workers who were working mostly as reelers and winders in the workload was found to be lower. Rationalization and mechanization scheme in the jute industry eliminated some of the manual processes which at one time were the preserve of women workers. Certain occupations giving employment to women in the jute industry early were found to be hazardous and are therefore closed to women now by the rules framed under the Factories Act. Rationalization of the production and the weaker sex being relieved of the labor considered too strenuous for them. Whatever the pretext, the fact is that the progressive elimination of women from the workforce has further strengthened the male dominance of economic life. In factories where machines are not only used but also made, women seems to disappear entirely. While Sharma at least reported that only males were employed in the car plant he studied, sheds totally omitted any mention of the fact that the workforce of Oriental did not apparently include a single woman. Where both sexes are employed, women are invariably in a small minority. In 1956, women formed only 11.7% of the workforce in manufacturing industries in India and were concentrated mostly in medium-sized to large enterprises. They were present in only 2 of 5 Pune factories which Lombard studied, and his sample was 96.6% male, which underrepresented their average in the enterprises in question. The same applies to Holmstrom's Bangalore study. 5.6% of his sample were women, compared with 15% of the factory workers in Karnataka as a whole. The bias is not unconnected with the code of social conduct, which makes them less easy to approach not only by male researchers but also by male co-workers. According to Holmstrom, study one women draftsman says the man in her office treat her as a sister, but she never goes among the men of the factory floor to discuss the design problems, and so she cannot get promotion. Women keep to themselves in the canteen, play a minor part in most clubs, and they only in the shadow of their husbands, and take little part in the union beyond attending general meetings and voting. It is no accident that women workers have a higher profile in Uma Ramaswamy's research. They formed 15% of the total workforce, but their participation in absolute as well as relative terms was declining. Again, this was part of a trend towards mechanization by which they in particular were victimized. At the time of the study, the output of one woman equaled that of 5 a few decades earlier. Their employment was falling even though their productivity was higher than that of a male workers. Why? The answer boils down to the fact that in practice it is easier to let men take the place of women than vice versa. In addition to all the manners of inhibitions connected to the employment of women, and regardless of their willingness to work night shifts, they have to be paid for the maternity leave. Factory regulation had also helped to reduce the differential wage level, which meant that the attraction of women as cheap labor was reduced. Supernumerary women are dismissed or transferred to unskilled work with the lower earnings. It is repeatedly shown that there are invariably the lowest paid workers. Insofar as they have not been completely ousted from the industrial labor force, women seem principally or exclusively to be assigned tasks which need no special knowledge or skill and which thought often monotonous require precision and alertness. When a certain job requires in the employer's eye delicate handling, or when the work is time consuming and tedious, women are called upon to do it. Thus, women are favored in the electronics industry for jobs which require tiny parts to be handled gently and carefully, and where fine wires have to be twisted and wound. In the textile industry, women have traditionally been employed as menders, spinners, winders, reelers, folders, and cotton waste pickers. In the pharmaceutical industry, women are generally employed as packers. For more than men, the jobs they can get keep them riveted to the bottom of the work hierarchy without the prospect of promotion. Lifestyle. Despite their considerable social heterogeneity, factory workers in the organized sector shared a number of characteristics that have to do with the industrial culture in which they work and live, and which distinguish them from the other components of the labor force. The expectation that a more homogeneous lifestyle would eventually emerge prompted various researchers to investigate the effect of industrial urban setting on household forms. In much of the literature, the industrial worker is a man living apart from his family and leading a bachelor's existence in the city. Only when thoroughly established, there would be joined by his wife and children who had been left behind in the village. But in southern India, labor migration was far less likely to lead to family separation. The worker was either accompanied by his family or was joined by them at the first opportunity. Asker saw it. Family reunion at the place of employment marked the transition to commitment. The worker is fully urbanized and never expects to leave the industrial life. His family is permanently resident in an urban area, and it is not unusual for the wife also to enter the labor market. In fact, one good test of the degree of commitment of a labor force is the percentage of it comprised by women. An uncommitted or semi-committed labor force is predominantly male. The committed worker depends for his security on his employer and on the state, not his tribe, his way of life in industrial. Low female participation in the industrial labor force is held in short to be symptomatic of low commitment. What this wholly implausible proposition ignores is that it is not that women are unwilling to take the factory work, but rather that they cannot get it. Those who do make use of precisely the same channels of influence and personalistic links as men. This explains why factory women are frequently close relatives of a male employee in the same enterprise. The greatest favor that a worker can hope for from the management or union is a job for his wife. If both works, they have an income that many middle class households would envy. In the early literature on the factory labor, the transition from the caste to the class, not whether but when, was widely discussed. So too was the breakup of the joint family, given its supposed incompatibility with the industrial urban life. Both caste and the joint family represented the traditional culture and social structure which would be progressively transformed by the new economy. The much smaller size of the average household in the industrial areas looked like confirmation, but faith in this theory that development would follow the same course as it was supposed to have taken in the West was gradually undermined. The realization dawned that for a very large segment of the rural population, the joint family had not been the only or even most common unit of cohabitation. Further, Singer in 1968 described the preservation of the albeit streamlined joint family among the industrial elite of the Chennai and showed how the home becomes the sphere of the religion and traditional values. Office and factory become the sphere of business and modern values, the phenomena which he called compartmentalization. Modernization was a much more complex and uneven process than was often supposed. In one sphere, tradition might rule, in another, the values of modernity. With regard to the joint family, however, Jan Bremen finds the argument unconvincing, not at least because it was entirely based on the households of the Chennai's captains of industry. Lombard, however, develops a similar thesis for the industrial workers. Though their households were not very different from those of other segments in the city's population as a whole, they did on average include more members, being frequently supplemented by all kinds of the relatives. This seemed to contradict the supposed transition to the conjugal family form. It is by no means certain, however, that this should be taken as evidence of the persistence of the traditional joint family. Jan Bremen would rather agree with Holmstrom that for the average factory worker, the earning and spending unit is the nuclear family settled in the city depending on one main earner, which expands to take relatives in need and then goes back to its normal size. Linked to the relatives elsewhere by the bonds of duty and sentiment, which are sometimes expensive. This alternation of expansion and contraction is based on obligations towards relatives. Cramped living space, limiting the possibility of the housing them indefinitely, and the inclusion of the additional members partly arising from the necessity of broadening the household's economic base by increasing the number of workers. To contrast the traditional joint family with the modern nuclear family is to ignore the fact that predominant working class household in the industrial urban milieu belongs to neither. It is rather a unit of cohabitation forced into being by low earnings and by specific conditions of employment. The National Commission on Labour report observed that the quality of accommodation for industrial labour had improved since the first generation of Ahatas in Kanpur, labour camps in Mumbai, Shantis in the south and Bastis in the eastern India, which over time had become even more miserable and congested. New urban housing colonies have been constructed, though they rapidly tend to be burdened by overcrowding. Some large industrial enterprises have their own quite respectable housing estates, but these cater to only a small fraction of the working class. The greater proportion have to make to do with primitive and confined living quarters in neighborhoods that are mostly dilapidated and sordid. Real change is seen inside the tenement. Earthen pots have been replaced by aluminium or brassware. Pieces of crockery are not an unusual possession. There are also items of furniture such as charpoy, a bench or a chair and a mosquito net. Radio, transistors, watches are often the proud possessions of not a few. This list of consumer goods, now 30 years old, would today include a sewing machine, bicycle or even a Hero Honda or a fan, refrigerator and a television. Most would have access to tap water and many to a toilet. The NCL report also comments on a new consumption patterns in a food and clothing. Regional specialities are now common throughout the nation, for which factory canteens are partly responsible. Some foods are now bought pre-prepared. Clothing and footwear have increased both in quantity and quality. Many labourers now wear overalls in the factory, and gone are the days when they went unshod and garbed only in short baggy trousers and a vest. A composite portrait of the average factory worker is difficult because the differentiation is so striking. The upper brackets consist of employees in capital intensive multinational corporations who should be included in the expanding middle class, and not only because of the nature of their employment but also due to their lifestyle. At the bottom is a colossal army of unskilled and semi-skilled workers in industries that lack almost any advanced technology and have far less attractive working conditions. Comparatively, these workers are not badly paid, but they are threatened by continual demands that they increase their low productivity and have more difficulty passing their jobs on to the next generation. However, great the distance between these two poles, they also share some crucial characteristics. In the first place, they are all in the regular employment, and the great majority receives a wage that fluctuates little. This is based on the hours they have put in, which in turn implies a clear distinction between the working and non-working times. Finally, their conditions of employment, not only of appointment, promotion and dismissal, but also a great diversity of secondary provisions regarding illness, vacations, pensions, dearness allowance, bonuses, etc., are governed by well-defined rules laid down in legislation and partly brought about by the trade union pressure. It is this combination of features which leads to consider workers in medium-sized and large industries as a dominant fraction of the working class in the industrial sector of the modern economy. Their lifestyle, culture, and consciousness reveals their commonality. They belong to a distinctive Indian industrial culture with typical assumptions and expectations and taste which cut across division of skill and age and origin. They share a common situation. They act and sometimes think of themselves as a group, if not a class, different from peasants, workers in the unorganized sector or in older factories with different technologies, from casual laborers, shopkeepers, professional people and so on. But they are only a small minority, and it is their high social, political and economic profile rather than their numbers that makes them dominant and a model for emulation amongst other segments of the working class. Should they therefore be regarded as a privileged elite who, like the dominant caste in the agrarian rural sphere, have appropriated a disproportionate share of scarce goods at the expense of other groups? Opinions differ. Their basic wage, which increases with the number of years worked, is supplemented by a dinner's allowance and other benefits. Their total earnings are significantly higher than that of other sections of the proletariat without formal labor contracts with their employers and various social provisions which also benefit their family, insure them against the risk and uncertainty. They know that they are privileged but are reluctant to share their advantages with the far larger masses of workers without them realizing that their extension to others might well result in their dilution. Lowering the citadel wall or the building more entrance gates would threaten inundation. So, according to some, this industrial vanguard has developed into a class that is solely concerned with the strengthening its own interest. It is organizational strength of industrial labor that prevents the transfer of resources from urban to rural sector and thereby to agricultural labor. If the power of the industrial labor is curbed and it is prevented from exploiting its strategic location in the growth of the Indian economy, efforts can be made to improve and a lot of rural poor. Sinha here summarizes a standard argument, though his own views are different, arguing that industrial wages have only risen in reaction to increases in the cost of living. He rejects the suggestion that capital accumulation has been delayed by draining of profits to organized sector labor for consumption. But the other authors continue to see them as labor aristocracy, whose privileged position explains why all over India the gap between their income and the wages paid to the agricultural workers is now far greater than ever. Conclusion. Coming to the end of this session, we shall summarize the concepts which are dealt in this session. Social profile and the lifestyle of the workers in India are discussed in detail. Several research reports are quoted to explain the scenario of the workers in the industrial setup. The role of literacy, caste and gender are explained in detail about the changes from the traditional setup regarding the employment. With these explanations, we shall conclude this session and continue the next session about the assertion of dignity of the laborer in the industrial setup. Thank you.